All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be looking at some major themes in history now and some important historical thinking skills. The first thing we're going to look at is a really good little acronym for looking at different areas of historical study. So as you get into a particular time period, I want you to consider these things. What's happening in terms of the politics, let's say, of the Roman Empire, right? What is it? What is its government like? What are the rulers like? What kind of diplomacy do the Romans do? What's the nature of warfare? What kind of intellectual ideas are there? Their ideas, sometimes their technologies, their basic principles that they live by. Um, what areas? What did they develop in terms of religion? What were their gods like? What were their rituals like? What ideologies did they have? Core beliefs, philosophies. What were their aesthetics like? Their art, their architecture, poetry, music, technology, their inventions, their sciences, their understanding of science that certainly evolves over time. Their economics, what were the resources that were important to them, natural resources, the types of trade that they engaged in, what was the nature of agriculture or industry, currency, money. Economics is important, very important. And some historians will argue that it's really economics that drive all the other things in not only politics, but certainly society. Gender roles. How do men and women relate to one another, especially when you have a division of labor in economic life? Men do certain things, women do other things. Economically, in terms of managing the household and sustaining the family. What are the social classes like? In sometimes they're classes based upon birth. What social class you are is dependent upon what your parents did. Other times it's based on economic wealth. Are we talking about rich and poor, or rich and middle class and poor, or working class? Classes, the nature of social classes changes over time. Other things that are socially important are the structure of the family, extended families, nuclear families, and so on, and also the very concept of work and leisure. What kind of activities do people engage in when they're not working? All right. You can consider all these areas in isolation, but as I've sort of pointed out here very, very quickly, the relationship between economics and some other things, they are really um, interdependent. There's nothing really very independent. And so a historian must carefully consider how these different categories of history work with each other. So that's one thing we need to consider. Then, over top of that, we have to overlay this notion of the historical thinking skills. And um, these are skills that are right now very fashionable in terms of uh, what colleges are expecting students to be able to do. Now, and I should say that that's not just in a history classroom. These are skills that can be applied to virtually any other discipline that requires critical thinking. And that means every other discipline requires some form of critical thinking. And so these historical thinking skills can be applied to a host of other subjects that you can be talking about, including the natural sciences. So those of you who are interested much more in sort of the biology and physics and chemistry and things like that, or astronomy, or oceanography, whatever, these are the types of skills that can actually have a close relationship to the natural sciences. Some don't. In history, chronological reasoning, understanding how chronologies work, basic timelines of events, is really, really important. Historical causation, though, is that next sort of deeper level. You could say, well, this happened and then this happened. That's fine. In the Middle Ages, that's how they told history. This happened and then this happened and then this happened. But what we're really interested in is establishing cause and effect relationship. Why did this happen? How did this event impact the next event? And when we talk about causes, we can talk about short-term and long-term causes. What is the interaction between multiple causes. No single event is so simplistic to only have one cause. There may be multiples. Right? How do we evaluate what's called historical contingency? Sometimes there are things that are coincidental. Some things we'll see that there's a direct cause and effect relationship. Sometimes we see that there is a correlation between sort of the odd incident that happens and a longer cause and effect relationship. So how do all these complex things work together? And then finally, when it comes to causes, we have to critique the existing interpretations of cause and effect. Is this historian setting up a legitimate relationship between cause and effect? Could we find other causes that were more important? A lot of times when you write historical essays, you're going to come down on one side of another. There's multiple causes, and you're going to pick a couple that you consider to be, in an essay, the most important. This is really why this event happened, and this was really the effect of this event. And that's really the bread and butter of not only historical understanding, but also historical writing. What do we see in terms of patterns of continuity and change over time? We need to be able to evaluate these patterns. Where are things remaining the same? Where are they changing? Why? Why do some things stay the same? Why do other things change? And then you could connect them to the larger historical processes that we looked at, the sort of the pirates acronym that we looked at a moment ago. How does this change in economic structure affect class structure? Or how do changes in economics create certain other continuities in political life, or vice versa? All right, so that's a very complex issue to deal with. And then finally, periodization. All right, we talk about specific periods in history. The Roman Empire, the Greeks, the Middle Ages. These are categories that have been established by other historians. So maybe they were right. Maybe they're wrong. Maybe the way that they were understood a long time ago is not necessarily the best way for them to be understood now. We know more things. We've discovered more detail and sources that reshape our way of understanding the past. So that might mean that our way of grouping periods kind of has to be a little bit more flexible. And as time goes on, we look back at the past and we say, wow, we could start to see a new pattern, a new period starting to emerge. Another really important historical thinking skill, set of skills, is comparison and what's called contextualization. Comparison is pretty easy. It means we compare related historical developments, right? Across time, across place, different countries, different regions, different parts of the world, so on and so forth, and different periods. You know, what happened in the Civil War era versus in the United States versus what happens in the Civil Rights Movement. Okay, those issues of race and equality and so on and so forth. Compare them, different time, different place. We can also explain and evaluate multiple perspectives on a particular phenomenon. So, you know, one comparison might work. There might be other comparisons that we can make. Okay, is one specific way of comparing necessary in all cases? No, absolutely not. We also must remember context, right? We have to explain and evaluate how historical phenomena and events, single historical events, or processes, longer term series of events, connect to broader regional, national, and global trends. Context is so key. You can't study, let's say, the Mongols without understanding what's happening in Asian history prior to the Mongol time, right? What allows for this rapid expansion of a recently unified barbarian, quote-unquote barbarian, nomadic tribe that are able to project their power and influence in one of the world's largest empires for a period of time. What's the background to all that? How does that work? How does that fit? Okay, and then you can see how these same phenomena can connect across time and place. How that model of empire of the Mongol Empire influences other empires that will succeed it. Then we start to turn our attention from just analyzing history, understanding how history happens, to actually doing it ourselves. And that's really probably one of the biggest changes that you'll be doing in a high school history course, is starting to really craft historical arguments of your own. You read, you evaluate, you assess primary and secondary sources, but then comes the time when you have to start making assessments of your own, writing them down, making them into PowerPoints, delivering them as short lessons, or like this type of format where you do something online, a recorded lecture, whatever. Historical argumentation is key to that. We analyze commonly accepted historical arguments. We see how they've been constructed, how other historians have put the facts together. And then we construct our own. We say, well, this historian put it together this way, but based on the evidence, some of the evidence that that historian may have used, some evidence that I may think is important, we put that together and we create a convincing interpretation and analysis of our own, of relevant evidence. We evaluate, we bring together conflicting historical evidence to construct a persuasive argument. We also appropriately use relevant historical evidence, right? If you're going to be making an argument, you have to support that argument with data, with supports, okay? And they can be different, all different types of sources that we can use. Refer back to the earlier lecture on sources. There are analysis features, okay? We looked at soapstone for one, that's for primary sources. Stamp for looking at secondary sources. So we have a way of approaching evidence, and we have to use that because we have to know what the evidence says. And so then, based on the analysis and evaluation of all that evidence that we compile, we make inferences and we draw conclusions. It's a lot like what you do in a science class. You gather your data from an experiment, right? You conduct an experiment, you observe what's going on, you record what happens when this boils at this time, and how this chemical reaction occurs. You gather that information, and then based upon the information that you've gathered, you draw a conclusion to that experiment. What's happening? Tell us why this is happening the way it's happening. And that leads us finally to interpretation and synthesis. We analyze and interpret various historical documents, right? And then we see how other historians and their perspectives have put that evidence together. That's the way they have interpreted it. The way you may interpret it is going to be different. And that's where history can get kind of fun and exciting, because you have these different perspectives, and they're gonna be different from one person to the next, and they're gonna change over time. So the way the American Revolution was understood 200 years ago, shortly after the Revolution, versus the way it was understood 100 years ago, versus the way it's understood now. Historians, Americans in general, have understood, reevaluated this most important part of American history time and time again, because it's kind of our birth story, and it's something that's very important to all of us. So we always go back to it and re-examine it. And then finally, we synthesize information, synthesis, to bring it all together. We combine a broad variety of evidence, and sometimes that evidence is contradictory. There's primary sources, there's secondary sources, there's all kinds of interpretations all over the place, and we have to put it together for ourselves. Okay? We can't go around and say, there's so many conflicting pieces of evidence, I don't know how to put it all together. Your challenge as a student of history, as an academic in a variety of fields, is to put it together in a way that makes the most sense to you. Okay? Because then what we do, and this is what makes all of this so relevant, we take the insights that you've gained about the past, about other historical contexts, about other cultures, other circumstances. We form an understanding of it so that we can apply it to our present day. So that, in effect, history becomes a learning event. That we understand how past societies have grappled with issues and apply that to the issues that we are grappling with today. And let's face it, there's no one-size-fits-all solution to any problem. We can't look back and say, well, 100 years ago, this was their solution to the problem, so let's just take that solution and use it today. There was a context by which that solution was framed back then in, the early 1900s. Our solution is going to be different because our context is different, our time period, the things that motivate us, the concerns that we have. They didn't have the information age back then, right? They didn't have the internet. They didn't have social media the way they did back then. You were lucky if you had a telephone then, right? There was no television. There was no radio. So the way they grappled with problems 100 years ago is going to be different than the way we grapple with them today. But we can still learn about the way they approached an issue. We might be able to use that approach, but our conclusions may be, and in all likelihood will be, different. So, for now, this is a lot to take in, and these are themes, ideas that we will be unpacking throughout the course of not only this year, but really throughout your historical education that you'll be taking through the rest of high school, and even as you go on into college or further studies beyond high school. But for now, however, thank you very much for listening.